I lay in my hospital bed, fever burning through my body at 103 degrees, listening to my 3 children argue in the hallway outside my room about who would not take care of me. Through the partially open door, I could hear every single word, every excuse, every complaint. I smiled weakly at the ceiling, my chest tight with pneumonia and something far worse than physical pain. When the nurse walked in with some papers about my treatment plan, I signed them with shaking hands and said absolutely nothing to my children about what I'd overheard. Sometimes silence is the most powerful response you can give. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 72 years old. I know that might sound old to some of you, but I still have a sharp mind and a strong heart, even if my body decided to betray me with pneumonia that week. Let me tell you who I really am, because it matters to this story. I'm not just some elderly woman in a hospital bed. I'm a survivor. I'm a fighter. And I'm a mother who gave absolutely everything for her children. 50 years ago, I arrived in Philadelphia with nothing but 2 suitcases and a dream for a better life. I was 22 years old, newly married, and terrified of everything. My husband Robert and I built our life from scratch, working jobs that Americans didn't want, saving every penny we could. We had 3 beautiful children, David, Susan, and Michael. For 15 years, we struggled together, but we were happy. We were a team. Then Robert died suddenly of a heart attack when he was only 37 years old. Our children were 12, 10, and 8. In one moment, I became a widow, a single mother, and the sole provider for 3 growing kids. I worked double shifts as a seamstress in a factory downtown. My fingers bled from the needles, my back ached from hunching over machines for 16 hours a day, but I never complained. Not once. I never took vacations. I never bought myself anything nice. I wore the same winter coat for 15 years because every single dollar I earned went into my children's futures. When David needed braces, I worked overtime for 6 months straight. When Susan wanted to go to college, I sold my mother's jade bracelet, the only valuable thing I owned, to help pay her tuition. When Michael wanted a big wedding, I took out a loan I spent 5 years repaying. I bought our house with money I saved over 20 years. Every payment felt like victory. I purchased a small commercial building downtown that I rented to businesses, creating a modest income for my retirement. I thought I was building security not just for myself, but for my children and their children. I thought I was teaching them about hard work, sacrifice, and family loyalty. I baked cookies for my 7 grandchildren every Sunday. I hosted family dinners where everyone laughed around my table. I listened to their problems and gave advice when they asked. I thought they loved me. But lying in that hospital bed, burning with fever, listening to my own children argue about who would be burdened with taking care of me, I realized something that shattered my heart into pieces. To them, I wasn't their mother anymore. I was an inconvenience, an obstacle, something standing between them and what they really wanted. And what they wanted, I would soon discover, was everything I had spent 50 years building. Before everything fell apart, my life was peaceful in a way I had always dreamed it would be. After decades of struggle and sacrifice, I had finally reached a point where I could breathe. I lived in a comfortable 2-story house in suburban Philadelphia, in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names. The house wasn't fancy or oversized, but it was mine, completely paid off. Every morning, I would stand on my front porch with a cup of green tea and look at that house with pride, remembering the young widow who once wondered how she'd keep a roof over her children's heads. My days followed a comforting routine that brought me genuine happiness. I would wake up at 6:30, even though I didn't have to anymore. Old habits from my factory days never quite left me. I'd make tea and sit in my small garden that I'd cultivated over the years. I grew tomatoes, herbs, and flowers that attracted butterflies. There was something deeply satisfying about putting my hands in the soil and watching things grow. It reminded me that I could still create life and beauty, even at my age. Sundays were my favorite. Every Sunday, I would bake chocolate chip cookies for my 7 grandchildren. They knew Grandma Maggie's house meant warm cookies, tight hugs, and a grandmother who actually listened to their stories about school and friends and their small dramas that felt so big to them. I cherished those moments more than anything money could buy. My 3 children visited regularly for family dinners. David would arrive with his wife and 2 teenagers, always complaining about traffic but smiling when he walked through my door. Susan came with her husband and 3 young children who would run through my house with joyful chaos. Michael, my youngest, would show up with his wife and their twin boys, usually bringing wine and stories about his growing business. We would all gather around my dining room table, the same table where I'd fed them as children, and we'd laugh. We'd talk. We'd feel like a family. I worked hard to make those dinners special. I'd cook their favorite dishes, the ones they remembered from childhood. I'd set the table with care. I'd make sure everyone felt welcome and loved. When they complimented my cooking, my heart would swell. When their children called me Grandma Maggie with bright, innocent smiles, I felt like every sacrifice I'd ever made was worth it. This was what I had worked for. This feeling. This connection. This family. Beyond my home, I had my rental property downtown. It was a small commercial building, nothing impressive, but it housed 3 small businesses who paid rent on time. The income wasn't enormous, but it was steady and reliable. It covered my living expenses comfortably and gave me security in my retirement. I managed the property myself, handling minor repairs and tenant concerns. I took pride in being a fair landlord and keeping the building in good condition. My life felt full. I had my garden, my Sunday cookie baking, my family dinners, my rental income, and my independence. I had friends in the neighborhood who would stop by for tea. I had my health mostly. I had built something real and lasting from absolutely nothing. When I went to bed each night in the home I'd worked so hard to own, I felt blessed, grateful, surrounded by love. I had no idea that behind my back, in secret meetings I knew nothing about, my children had been planning how to take it all away from me for months. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September when the first crack appeared in my perfect illusion. I had a doctor's appointment that morning for a routine checkup, nothing serious, just the regular monitoring that comes with being over 70. The appointment finished earlier than expected because my doctor was running ahead of schedule for once. I drove home feeling good, humming along to the oldies station on the radio, thinking about what I'd make for dinner. When I pulled into my driveway at 1:30 in the afternoon, I noticed David's black SUV parked on the street and Susan's silver sedan right behind it. My first thought was pleasant surprise. It wasn't unusual for my children to visit, but it was odd for 2 of them to be here on a Thursday afternoon without telling me. David worked in finance and usually kept strict office hours. Susan managed a marketing firm and was always busy with client meetings. What were they doing here in the middle of a workday? I grabbed my purse and walked up to my front door, expecting to find them waiting on the porch. But the door was unlocked. They were already inside. I felt a small flutter of confusion. I had given all my children keys years ago for emergencies, but they'd never just let themselves in without calling first. It felt like a boundary had been crossed, something subtle but definitely present. I walked through my living room and heard voices coming from the kitchen. Low voices, serious voices, not the casual, happy tones of children dropping by to surprise their mother. As I got closer, I heard papers rustling and Susan's voice saying something about assessed value, and David responding with, "If we can get her to agree before." The moment I stepped into my kitchen, everything changed. David and Susan were sitting at my kitchen table, with documents spread out between them. The papers covered half the table. I saw folders, printouts, and what looked like official forms. The second they heard my footsteps, their heads snapped up with identical expressions of shock. Susan actually jumped slightly in her chair. "Mom, you're back early," Susan said, her voice climbing to an unnaturally high pitch. Her smile appeared instantly, but it was all wrong. Too bright, too forced, like a mask she'd pulled on too quickly. David's hand shot out and covered one of the documents, pressing his palm flat against it as if he could make it invisible. "Just going over some old family photos," David said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. His voice was casual, but his body language was tense, like a teenager caught doing something forbidden. Family photos? There wasn't a single photograph on that table, just papers. Official-looking papers. "What are you two doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice gentle and curious rather than accusatory. I didn't want to seem like a suspicious, paranoid mother, but my heart was beating faster than normal. "Nothing, Mom, just catching up," Susan said, already standing and gathering the papers with rushed, jerky movements. She was shoving documents into folders without any care for organization, just trying to make them disappear from my view. David stood too, helping her collect everything. Within seconds, the table was clear except for the spot where David's hand had been. I caught a glimpse of one paper before it vanished into Susan's bag. The letterhead said, "Montgomery Property Assessment Services," with a logo I recognized from real estate transactions. Why would my children have property assessment documents in my kitchen? My house had been paid off for over a decade. I hadn't requested any assessments. "We should get going," David said, checking his watch with exaggerated concern. "I have a meeting at 3. Susan nodded eagerly, already moving toward the doorway with her bag clutched against her chest like she was protecting something precious or hiding something damaging. They each gave me quick kisses on the cheek, the kind of obligatory pecks that held no real warmth. "Love you, Mom," they said in near unison, already heading for the door. "We'll call you soon." Then they were gone, leaving me standing alone in my kitchen with the echo of their hasty departure hanging in the air. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty table where those papers had been spread out. My kitchen suddenly felt different, like a crime scene after the evidence had been removed. There was a strange heaviness settling in my chest, a feeling I couldn't quite name but definitely couldn't ignore. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge yet, I knew those papers had something to do with me, my property, and plans I wasn't supposed to know about. That night, I stood at my kitchen sink washing dishes that didn't really need washing, scrubbing the same plate 3 times while my mind replayed the afternoon over and over. The image of David's hand, slamming down on those documents, Susan's fake smile, the way they'd fled from my house like guilty children. I kept trying to rearrange the pieces into something that made sense, something innocent, something that didn't make my stomach twist with anxiety. "You're being paranoid," I whispered to myself, setting the plate in the drying rack. "You're just an overly sensitive old woman, imagining problems that don't exist." I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe they were planning a surprise party for my upcoming birthday in November. That would explain the secrecy and the rushed exit. Maybe those property assessment papers were for their own homes, and they'd just chosen my kitchen as a convenient meeting place. Maybe I'd misread the letterhead entirely. My eyesight wasn't what it used to be after all. I dried my hands on a kitchen towel and tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. My children were good people. I had raised them to be honest, hardworking, and kind. They weren't perfect, but whose children were? They had busy lives, demanding jobs, and families of their own to worry about. Of course, they seemed distracted sometimes. Of course, they couldn't always explain every little thing to their elderly mother. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat in my favorite armchair, the one by the window where I could see my garden even in the fading evening light. I thought back over recent conversations, searching for context that would make everything make sense. David had asked me several questions about my rental property over the past few months. When had I bought it? What was it worth now? How much rental income did it generate? At the time, I'd thought he was just making conversation, maybe showing interest in real estate investing for himself. And Susan. She'd asked about the deed to my house just last month. I remembered that clearly now. She'd said something about helping me organize my important documents, about making sure everything was in order in case of emergencies. "You know, Mom, at your age, it's important to have these things accessible," she'd said, with what I thought was loving concern. I'd thanked her for caring and told her everything was filed properly in my home office. Even Michael had shown unusual interest in my bank statements recently. He'd offered to help me set up online banking, claiming it would be easier for me than going to the bank in person. "Mom, you need to modernize," he'd laughed. "Everyone does their banking online now." I'd resisted because I liked the personal interaction at my local branch, liked knowing the tellers by name. Had that annoyed him? I sipped my tea and forced myself to see these memories through the lens of love rather than suspicion. They were just trying to help their aging mother. They were being responsible adult children, making sure I had my affairs in order. There was nothing sinister about that. It was actually thoughtful, wasn't it? "They love you," I said aloud to the empty room, needing to hear the words. "You raised them right. They would never do anything to hurt you." But even as I spoke those reassurances, even as I deliberately pushed down the anxiety rising in my chest, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was deeply wrong. I ignored that voice. I had to, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that the three people I'd sacrificed everything for, the three people I loved more than my own life, might be capable of betraying me. That possibility was too painful to consider, so I didn't. I finished my tea, checked that all the doors were locked, and went to bed. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, telling myself I was worrying over nothing while my heart beat with an unease I couldn't quite silence. Tomorrow, I decided, everything would look different. Tomorrow, this strange afternoon would fade into insignificance. Tomorrow, I would laugh at myself for being so paranoid. But tomorrow would only bring harder truths I couldn't ignore. 2 weeks passed, and I almost managed to convince myself that I'd overreacted about the kitchen incident. Life returned to its normal rhythm. I tended my garden, baked cookies, answered phone calls from my grandchildren. But then came the call that shattered my carefully constructed denial into 1,000 irreparable pieces. It was a Tuesday morning, around 10 o'clock. I was watering my tomato plants when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized immediately, Patterson and Associates. Mr. Gerald Patterson had been my lawyer for 30 years, ever since I'd bought my house. He'd handled my will, my rental property purchase, and every legal matter I'd ever needed. He was more than my lawyer. He was someone I trusted completely. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. Cautious, concerned, almost apologetic. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time, but something came up that I felt I needed to verify with you directly." My hand tightened around the phone. "Of course, Gerald. What is it?" He cleared his throat. "I received an unusual request yesterday from someone claiming to be your designated power of attorney. This person was asking for copies of your property documents, specifically the deed to your rental building, and also requesting detailed information about the terms of your current will." The garden seemed to tilt slightly. I sat down on my porch steps, my legs suddenly unsteady. "I've never designated power of attorney to anyone," I said slowly, each word feeling heavy in my mouth. "Gerald, you know that. We've discussed it before. I've specifically chosen not to assign that to anyone while I'm still perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." "That's exactly why I'm calling," he said. "I have no documentation of any power of attorney assignment from you, which is why this request raised immediate red flags for me. The person seemed to know very specific details about your assets, which concerned me even more." My mouth went dry. "Who was it? Who called you?" There was a pause, and I could hear him taking a breath, preparing to deliver information he knew would hurt me. "Margaret, it was your son David. He called from his office, very professional, very confident. He had very specific questions about the transfer process for your rental property and seemed to know details about your financial portfolio that surprised me. When I asked him to provide documentation of the power of attorney, he became defensive and said you must have forgotten to file it with me. He suggested that perhaps your memory wasn't what it used to be." The words hit me like physical blows. My memory. David had told my lawyer that my memory was failing. He was planting seeds of doubt about my mental competency with the one person who held all my legal documents. The calculation of it, the deliberate manipulation, took my breath away. "My memory is perfectly fine," I said, my voice shaking with anger and hurt. "And I never gave David or anyone else power of attorney." "I know that, Margaret. That's why I called you immediately, instead of providing any information. But I think you need to be aware that someone is actively trying to access your legal and financial information without your knowledge or consent." After I hung up, I sat on my porch steps for a long time, staring at nothing. My hands were trembling, my heart was pounding. The denial I'd wrapped myself in for 2 weeks crumbled completely. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't innocent concern for an aging mother. This was calculated. This was planned. This was betrayal. I stood up slowly and walked into my house on unsteady legs. I went straight to my home office, to the filing cabinet where I kept all my important documents organized in labeled folders. I pulled open the drawer and reached for the folder marked Property Documents. My fingers fumbled through the contents, searching for the deed to my rental building. It wasn't there. I pulled out every paper, spreading them across my desk. No deed. I checked the folder marked Estate Planning, where I kept a copy of my updated will. Also missing. The last time I'd seen these documents, they'd been right here, exactly where they belonged. I was meticulous about my filing system. These papers hadn't been misplaced. They'd been taken. The only people who had keys to my house were my 3 children. The only people who knew where I kept my important documents were my 3 children. The only people who would benefit from having access to these documents were my 3 children. I sank into my desk chair, holding the empty folders in my shaking hands. This was real. This wasn't my imagination or paranoia or the confused thoughts of an aging mind. My own children were plotting something behind my back, something that required my legal documents, something that involved questioning my mental capacity to my lawyer. The evidence was undeniable now, and I could no longer pretend otherwise. I didn't sleep for 3 nights after discovering my missing documents. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions that had terrible answers. Finally, on Saturday morning, I decided I couldn't live with uncertainty anymore. I needed to hear the truth directly from my children's mouths, no matter how much it would hurt. I picked up my phone and sent a group text to all 3 of them. "Family meeting at my house tomorrow, Sunday, 2 p.m. This is important. Everyone needs to be there." Sunday afternoon arrived with beautiful sunshine that felt completely wrong for what was about to happen. At exactly 2 o'clock, all 3 of my children walked through my door. David arrived first, checking his watch with visible irritation. Susan came next, her smile tight and forced. Michael was last, already complaining before he even sat down. "Mom, what's so urgent?" Michael said, dropping onto my couch with an exaggerated sigh. "I had to cancel my golf game for this. It's my only day off." I stood in front of them, my hands clasped together to keep them from shaking. I'd rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times, but now that it was here, my throat felt tight. "I need to ask you something, and I need honest answers." David leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Okay, what is it?" "My lawyer called me 2 weeks ago," I said, watching their faces carefully. "Someone contacted him claiming to be my power of attorney, requesting copies of my property documents and information about my will. David, would you know anything about that?" The change in David's expression was instant. His face flushed deep red, starting at his neck and spreading upward. His eyes darted to Susan, then to Michael, then back to me. The silence in the room was deafening. "Mom, I can explain," David started, his voice defensive. "Explain what?" I interrupted, my voice stronger now, fueled by weeks of suppressed pain and anger. "Explain why you're trying to access my legal documents without my knowledge? Explain why you told my lawyer that my memory is failing when you know that's not true?" Susan leaned forward, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mom, you're misunderstanding the situation. We're just trying to help you. You're getting older, and these things need to be organized properly. We're thinking about your future, about what's best for you." "Organized?" I repeated, the word tasting bitter. "Or transferred? There's a difference, Susan, and we both know it." Michael stood up abruptly, his face twisted with frustration. "Look, Mom, let's just be honest here. You're 72 years old. You're not getting any younger. That rental property downtown is just sitting there, and frankly, you barely manage it properly anymore. The tenants call us when things break because they can't reach you. You forget to deposit rent checks. We thought it would be better if we took over the management, maybe even sold it and invested the money more wisely for your retirement." "Better for whom?" I asked quietly. "Better for me? Or better for you?" The room exploded. All three of them started talking at once, their voices rising, their true feelings finally spilling out without the veneer of false concern. David said I was being unreasonable and stubborn. Susan said they'd been discussing this for months and had already talked to real estate agents about potential market value. Michael said the property was too much responsibility for someone my age and that I should be grateful they were willing to handle it. I stood there listening to my children argue about my property as if I wasn't even in the room, as if I was already dead, as if everything I'd worked 50 years to build was already theirs to claim and divide. They weren't asking for my permission or input. They were informing me of decisions they'd already made without me. "So you've been planning this behind my back," I said, my voice cutting through their arguing. "Meeting in secret, contacting my lawyer, talking to real estate agents, all without ever once asking me what I wanted." "Because we knew you'd react exactly like this," David snapped. "You're too emotional about it. You can't see that we're trying to help you." I looked at my three children, really looked at them, and saw strangers. Entitled strangers who saw me not as their mother, but as an obstacle standing between them and money they believed they deserved. In that moment, something inside me broke. Not my spirit, but my illusions. The fantasy that I'd raised loving, grateful children shattered completely. "Get out," I said quietly. "Mom," Susan started. "Get out of my house," I repeated, louder this time. "All of you. Now." They left, still trying to argue, still trying to justify themselves. I closed the door behind them and locked it. Then I walked to my bedroom, sat on the edge of my bed, and finally let myself feel the full weight of their betrayal. After that devastating Sunday, I couldn't just sit in my grief and do nothing. I needed to know the full truth, no matter how much it would hurt. If my children were capable of what I'd already discovered, what else had they done that I didn't know about? The next morning, I called my bank and asked to speak with the manager, Mrs. Chen, a woman I'd known for 15 years. "Margaret, how nice to hear from you," she said warmly. "What can I help you with today?" "I need to know if anyone has tried to make changes to my accounts recently," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "Anyone other than me?" There was a pause. "Actually, yes. About 3 months ago, your daughter Susan came in requesting to be added as a joint account holder on your primary savings account. She said you'd discussed it and that you wanted her to have access in case of emergencies." My hand gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. What happened? "I told her that for a change like that, we would need you to come in person and sign the authorization yourself. She seemed frustrated and mentioned something about you having memory issues and difficulty getting around, which surprised me because I'd just seen you the week before and you seemed perfectly fine. I refused to process anything without your direct, in-person authorization." "Thank you," I whispered, my heart pounding. "Thank you for protecting me." After hanging up, I sat frozen in my chair. Susan had tried to access my bank accounts 3 months ago. 3 months. This conspiracy had been going on far longer than I'd imagined. I needed professional help to uncover the full extent of what my children were doing. I found a private investigator through Mr. Patterson's recommendation, a retired police detective named Robert Torres, who specialized in financial fraud and family disputes. What he uncovered over the next week made me physically ill. Mr. Torres showed me photographs he'd taken of my 3 children meeting at an upscale restaurant downtown. Not once, but multiple times over the past 6 months. In the photos, they were leaning over documents, pointing at papers, their expressions serious and calculated. He'd followed them to the office of an estate planning lawyer I'd never heard of, a man named Richard Brennan, who apparently specialized in conservatorships and competency evaluations. They've been consulting with Brennan about the legal process for having you declared mentally incompetent, Mr. Torres explained, showing me copies of emails his sources had obtained. They want to establish guardianship over you, which would give them complete control of your finances and property. I read the emails with shaking hands. Michael's wife had written, "Once we get the conservatorship in place, we can sell the rental property immediately. The market is hot right now, and we shouldn't wait." Susan had responded, "We need to move her into assisted living first. It'll be easier to handle everything if she's not in the house." David had added, "I've already looked at facilities. There's one in Delaware that's affordable and far enough away that she won't be constantly calling us." They were planning to have me declared incompetent, to strip away my independence, to warehouse me in a nursing home while they liquidated everything I'd spent my life building. And they'd been planning this for at least 6 months, maybe longer. Mr. Torres pulled out another folder. "There's more. I checked the public records for your rental property. Your son David has been meeting with commercial developers for the past 2 months. He's been giving them tours of the building and discussing potential sale prices, all without your knowledge or authorization." He showed me more photographs. David shaking hands with men in expensive suits outside my rental building. David pointing at the property's features. David clearly acting as if he already owned it. The investigator had even recorded one conversation where David told a developer, "My mother is elderly and not really managing this property effectively anymore. Once we formalize the transfer, you'll be dealing directly with me." I felt physically sick. This wasn't just about greed or inheritance. This was a coordinated, calculated plan to erase me from my own life. They divided up responsibilities like a business operation. David handled the property sale. Susan worked on accessing the bank accounts. Michael researched nursing homes. They'd been meeting regularly, strategizing, planning every detail of how to take control of my assets while I was still alive. The investigator showed me one final email that broke whatever was left of my heart. It was from Susan to her siblings. "We need to act soon. She's still healthy and sharp. If we wait too long, it'll be harder to make the incompetency case stick. The lawyer says the best time is now, while we can still claim early cognitive decline." They weren't waiting for me to die. They weren't even waiting for me to actually become incapable. They were actively plotting to fabricate a case against my mental competency so they could take everything while I was still perfectly healthy and aware. They wanted me out of the way, locked in a facility where I couldn't interfere with their plans. I sat in my living room that night, surrounded by evidence of my children's betrayal, and realized this was never about concern for my well-being. This was about money, greed, and entitlement. They looked at me and saw only assets to claim and an inconvenient obstacle to remove. That night, I couldn't bear to turn on the lights. I sat in my dark living room surrounded by the evidence Mr. Torres had given me, photographs and documents spread across my coffee table like accusations. The only illumination came from the streetlight outside, casting long shadows that made everything look distorted and unfamiliar. My own home felt like a stranger's house. My own life felt like someone else's nightmare. I picked up a framed photograph from the side table. David at 5 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on my lap at his kindergarten graduation. I remembered that day so clearly. I'd worked a double shift the night before, then rushed to his school still wearing my factory uniform because I didn't have time to change. He'd pointed at me in the audience with such pride, not caring that I looked exhausted and worn, just happy his mama was there. I traced his little face in the photo with my finger and whispered, "Where did you go? Where did my little boy go?" I reached for another picture. Susan at 16, in her prom dress that I'd sewn by hand because we couldn't afford to buy one. She'd cried when she saw it, threw her arms around me and said, "You're the best mom in the world. I'll never forget this." I'd stayed up for 3 nights straight after my factory shifts, my fingers bleeding from needle pricks, my eyes burning from exhaustion. But seeing her face light up had made every painful moment worth it. Now that same daughter was plotting to lock me away in a nursing home in another state so I wouldn't be a bother. Michael's wedding photo sat on the mantel. I stood up and walked to it, picking it up with trembling hands. He looked so happy in his tuxedo, his bride beautiful beside him. I'd taken out a $15,000 loan to help pay for that wedding because he dreamed of a specific venue he couldn't afford. It had taken me 5 years to pay off that loan, 5 years of eating cheaply and denying myself small luxuries. When he'd asked for the money, he'd hugged me tight and said, "I don't know how I'll ever repay you, Mom. You've given me everything." Now I knew how he planned to repay me, by stealing everything I had left. "I gave you everything," I whispered to the empty room, my voice breaking. "I had nothing, and I built everything for you. I wore the same winter coat for 15 years, so you could have new clothes each season. I ate rice and vegetables so you could have meat. I never went on vacation so you could go on school trips. I worked until my hands bled so you could go to college." The sobs came then, deep and wrenching, tearing through my chest like something physical. I sank to the floor, still clutching Michael's wedding photo, and cried in a way I hadn't cried since the day my husband died. But this hurt worse. Robert's death had been a tragedy, but it wasn't a choice. This was a choice. My children were choosing to betray me. They were choosing greed over gratitude. They were choosing to see me as an obstacle rather than as the mother who'd sacrificed everything for their happiness. For hours, I sat on that floor surrounded by photographs of smiling children who no longer existed, at least not in the form I'd believed they did. I mourned them as if they'd died, because in a way, they had. The children I thought I'd raised, kind, grateful, loving, were never real. Or perhaps they'd been real once, but had transformed into these strangers who discussed my institutionalization over email like it was a business transaction. I looked around at the walls of my home, the house I'd worked 20 years to pay off, and it suddenly felt like a museum of wasted love. Every piece of furniture held a memory of sacrifice. The dining table where I'd served them thousands of meals. The couch where I'd comforted them through breakups and failures. The kitchen where I'd baked birthday cakes with money I'd saved from skipping my own meals. All of it felt hollow now, like props in a play where I'd been the only one who didn't know it was fiction. My body shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my lungs, from some wounded place in my soul where a mother's love lived. I'd believed that love was returned, that it mattered, that it meant something. But those emails proved I was wrong. To them, I was worth less than my bank balance. My life's work was worth more than my life. As dawn broke through my windows, I was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by photographs and evidence, my face swollen from crying. I looked at my reflection in the dark television screen across from me, an old woman, broken and betrayed, everything she'd built crumbling around her. But somewhere in that reflection, beneath the tears and pain, I saw something else beginning to form, something cold and determined, something that refused to be destroyed. I woke up on my living room floor as morning sunlight streamed through the windows, my body stiff and aching, my face swollen from hours of crying. For a moment I lay there disoriented. Then the memories of last night crashed back over me. The evidence, the emails, the betrayal, everything. I pushed myself up slowly, my joints protesting, and walked to the bathroom. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My eyes were red and puffy, my face pale and haggard. I looked exactly like what my children wanted me to be, a weak, helpless old woman who could be easily controlled and discarded. "No," I said to my reflection, my voice hoarse but firm. "No, I will not be this." I washed my face with cold water, scrubbing away the tears and the weakness. As the water ran down my cheeks, I felt something shifting inside me. The grief that had consumed me all night was transforming into something harder, sharper, more powerful. Anger. But not the hot, explosive kind that makes you lose control. This was cold, calculated fury that cleared my mind instead of clouding it. I dried my face and looked in the mirror again, really looked. Yes, I was 72 years old. Yes, I had wrinkles and gray hair. But I was not weak. I was not senile. I was not a helpless victim waiting to be institutionalized. I was Margaret Chen, the woman who'd immigrated with nothing and built an empire through sheer determination. I was the widow who'd raised 3 children alone while working double shifts. I was a survivor who'd overcome poverty, grief, and every obstacle life had thrown at me. "They think I'm weak," I said to my reflection, standing straighter despite my aching back. "They think I'm just a confused old woman they can manipulate and control. They forgot who taught them everything they know about resilience and strength. They forgot who I really am." My children had made a critical mistake. They'd underestimated me. They'd been so focused on my age, so confident in their plan, that they'd forgotten I was smarter than all 3 of them combined. I'd survived things they couldn't imagine. I'd built things from nothing, and I certainly wasn't going to let them destroy me without a fight. I walked to my bedroom and changed into fresh clothes, moving with purpose now instead of despair. The tears were done. The mourning was over. Now it was time for action. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Mr. Patterson's number. My hand was steady as I pressed call. "Gerald," I said when he answered, my voice clear and strong. "I need to see you today, and I need you to prepare some very specific legal documents. My children think they can take everything from me. They're about to learn a lesson about consequences they'll never forget." For the first time in days, I smiled. Not a warm, motherly smile, but the smile of a woman who'd stopped being a victim and become a warrior. Over the next month, I executed my plan with the precision of a general preparing for battle. Every move was calculated. Every step was deliberate. My children thought I was just a sentimental old woman, but I was about to show them I was a strategic mastermind who'd learned from 50 years of fighting for survival. My first meeting with Mr. Patterson lasted 3 hours. I laid out all the evidence Mr. Torres had gathered, the emails, the photographs, the documentation of their conspiracy. Gerald's face grew darker with each piece of evidence. "Margaret, this is elder abuse. You could press charges," he said. But I shook my head. Criminal charges weren't enough. I wanted something more complete, more devastating. I wanted them to lose everything they'd been plotting to steal. We created an entirely new will, completely removing all 3 children. Every single asset, my house, my rental property, my savings, everything, would go to a charitable foundation I was establishing for underprivileged children's education. The irony wasn't lost on me. The children I'd sacrificed everything for would get nothing, while children who actually needed help would benefit from my life's work. Next, I transferred ownership of my rental property into an irrevocable trust with myself as the sole lifetime beneficiary. This made it legally impossible for anyone to claim it, contest it, or force its sale. The property was untouchable, locked away where my children's greedy hands could never reach it. Then I went to a different bank across town and opened new accounts, transferring most of my savings. I left just enough in my old accounts to avoid suspicion, but not enough to matter. My financial assets effectively disappeared from where my children expected to find them. The next phase was gathering undeniable proof of their conspiracy. I installed tiny hidden cameras throughout my house, in the living room, kitchen, and hallway, all with audio recording capabilities. I bought a discreet recording device that looked like a regular pen and kept it in my purse. Then I systematically invited each child to lunch separately, asking innocent questions about their plans for my future, while the device captured every damning word. David talked about getting her evaluated for dementia by a doctor we can trust. Susan discussed the nursing home in Delaware that's far enough away. She can't just show up at our houses. Michael coldly calculated how quickly we can liquidate the rental property once we have conservatorship. The market's hot, we shouldn't wait. Every conversation was recorded. Every admission of their plan was documented. They spoke freely, believing their elderly mother was too naive to be gathering evidence against them. Finally came the most crucial piece: my accidental hospitalization. I'd been feeling genuinely unwell, a chest cold that was worsening. But instead of treating it aggressively, I let it develop into pneumonia. I downplayed my symptoms, delayed seeking treatment, and when I finally went to the hospital, I was sick enough to require admission. This was the test. This was where they'd reveal their true selves in a moment of crisis. And as I lay in that hospital bed listening to them argue about who wouldn't take care of me, I knew I had them exactly where I wanted them. The trap was set. Now I just needed to spring it. My hospital stay lasted 3 days. 3 days of listening to my children complain about the inconvenience of my illness while I quietly finalized the last pieces of my plan. The recording device hidden in my phone captured every word of their hallway arguments. "This is the worst timing," David had hissed. "Can't she just recover quickly?" Susan had responded, "We need to look caring, at least until the conservatorship goes through." Their words were daggers, but I smiled through the pain, knowing each sentence was another nail in their coffin. When I was finally discharged, Michael drove me home with visible resentment, sighing heavily at every red light. "You know, Mom, you really should think about hiring a full-time nurse. This is too much for us to handle with our busy schedules." I simply nodded, said nothing, and let him believe I was considering it. That evening, I called Mr. Patterson. "It's time," I said simply. "Schedule the family meeting for this Sunday at 2 o'clock. Tell them I want to discuss my estate planning and future care arrangements." I could hear the satisfaction in his voice when he agreed. He'd witnessed all the evidence, heard all the recordings, and he was ready to help me deliver justice. I spent the week preparing my living room like a courtroom. I positioned chairs strategically so everyone would face me. I set up my laptop on a side table, angled away from where my children would sit, with a video call already configured to extended family members and close friends. They would witness everything remotely without my children knowing. I tested the audio equipment 3 times to ensure the recordings would play clearly through my television speakers. Sunday morning, I dressed carefully, not in the frail, elderly clothes my children expected, but in a sharp navy blazer and crisp white blouse. I looked like the businesswoman I'd always been, not the helpless victim they wanted me to be. I applied makeup to hide my anxiety, styled my hair, and stood tall. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a warrior preparing for her final battle. Mr. Patterson arrived 30 minutes early, bringing printed copies of all the evidence in organized folders. My financial advisor, whom I'd brought into my confidence, came next. Then Rose, my best friend of 40 years, who would serve as witness. We arranged everything methodically: the documents, the remote laptop connection, the audio equipment cued to the most damning recordings. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard cars pulling into my driveway. Through the window, I watched David, Susan, and Michael walk toward my front door. They were actually smiling, talking casually, completely unaware of what awaited them inside. David checked his watch. Susan carried a folder, probably papers they were planning to pressure me into signing. Michael straightened his tie, looking confident and self-assured. They thought they were walking into their victory meeting, the moment when their elderly, weakened mother would finally surrender control. They had no idea they were walking into an ambush. The doorbell rang. I took a deep breath, nodded to Mr. Patterson, and walked to answer it. My hand was steady on the doorknob. My voice was calm when I greeted them. "Thank you all for coming. Please, sit down. We have a lot to discuss." The trap was ready to snap shut. My 3 children settled into their chairs with barely concealed smugness. David loosened his tie like a man preparing for an easy negotiation. Susan set her folder on the coffee table with a confident smile. Michael leaned back casually, already looking bored. They had no idea that extended family members, neighbors, and close friends were watching silently through the laptop camera positioned behind them. "Thank you all for coming," I began, standing in front of them with my hands clasped. "I wanted to discuss my estate and my future care arrangements, since I know this has been very much on your minds." David nodded eagerly, sitting forward. "We're glad you're finally being reasonable about this, Mom. We've been worried about you." "Worried," I repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the air. "That's an interesting choice of words, David. Mr. Patterson, would you please play the recordings?" The confusion on their faces was almost comical. "Recordings?" Susan asked, her smile faltering. "What recordings?" My lawyer pressed a button on the remote, and suddenly the room filled with David's voice from the hospital hallway. "Can't she just recover quickly? I had the lake house planned." Then Susan's voice. "We need to look caring, at least until the conservatorship goes through." Then Michael's cold calculation. "Once we have conservatorship, we can liquidate everything. The market's hot right now." The color drained from their faces like water from a broken glass. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Mom, wait, you don't understand?" "I understand perfectly." I cut him off, my voice razor sharp. "Mr. Patterson, please continue." More recordings played. Their restaurant conversations about declaring me incompetent. Susan's attempt to add herself to my bank accounts. David's meetings with developers about selling my property. Michael's research into Delaware nursing homes where I'd be conveniently far away. Every damning word they'd spoken, every cold calculation they'd made, filled my living room like toxic smoke. Susan's hands were shaking. "Mom, we can explain. This isn't what it sounds like." "Really?" I walked to the television and displayed the emails Mr. Torres had obtained. "Then explain this email from you, Susan. We need to act soon while we can still claim early cognitive decline." Or this one from Michael's wife. "Once we get conservatorship, we can sell the rental property immediately." Michael stood, his face flushed with anger and panic. "You had no right to—" "I had every right." My voice rose for the first time, filled with months of suppressed fury. "This is my life, my property, my assets, and you were plotting to steal it all." I turned to face them fully, my entire body shaking with righteous anger. "You tried to convince my lawyer I was senile. You stole documents from my home. You conspired to have me declared incompetent when I'm perfectly healthy. You planned to warehouse me in a nursing home so you could liquidate my life's work without interference." David's voice was desperate now. "Mom, please, we were just trying to help." "Help?" I laughed bitterly. "Mr. Patterson has filed all of this evidence, recordings, emails, photographs, witness statements, with the court, but here's what you failed to understand through all your scheming." I paused, letting the tension build, watching their faces contort with growing horror. "You don't own anything." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. My children stared at me with identical expressions of confused horror, not yet understanding the full magnitude of what I'd just said. I savored that moment before continuing. "That house you were planning to sell, David?" I said, my voice cold and precise. "It's in an irrevocable trust. You can't touch it. That rental property you've been showing to developers discussing sale prices and splitting the profits? I transferred it to a charitable foundation last month. It's gone, permanently." David's face went from red to chalk white. "You can't— That's not— My bank accounts?" I continued, ignoring his stammering. "I moved everything to a different bank. The accounts you know about have just enough to cover my monthly expenses. The rest? Somewhere you'll never find it." I turned to Susan, whose hands were gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles were bone white. "Sorry, Susan. You won't be adding yourself as a joint account holder after all." "What about your will?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though I could hear the desperation in it. I smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "My will. Yes, let's talk about that. Mr. Patterson, please show them." My lawyer opened a folder and handed each of them a copy. I watched their eyes scan the document, watched the exact moment comprehension hit them. Susan actually gasped. David's hands began to tremble. Michael dropped the papers as if they'd burned him. "You removed us?" David said, his voice cracking. "You left everything to a charity?" "Not just any charity," I corrected. "A foundation for underprivileged children's education. Children who actually need help, who will be grateful for opportunities, who won't plot to steal from the people who sacrifice for them." The irony is poetic, don't you think? The children I gave everything to get nothing, while children who have nothing will get everything. "Mom, please," Susan was crying now, real tears streaming down her face. "We made mistakes, but we're still your children. You can't do this." "I can, and I have," I said flatly. "But wait, there's more." I gestured to the laptop they still hadn't noticed. "Everyone you care about has been watching this entire conversation. Your cousins, our neighbors, my friends, members of our community. They've heard the recordings. They've seen the evidence. They know exactly who you are." All three of them spun around, finally seeing the laptop with its camera light glowing. The horror on their faces deepened as they realized their humiliation was public, witnessed by dozens of people who would spread this story through every corner of their social and professional worlds. "You destroyed us," Michael whispered, his face ashen. "No," I corrected quietly. "You destroyed yourselves. I simply made sure everyone could see what you really are." I stood taller, my voice steady and final. "You chose greed over your mother. You saw me as an obstacle instead of a blessing. Now live with nothing. Get out of my house, all of you, and don't ever come back." They stumbled toward the door, broken and defeated, their grand conspiracy shattered. As the door closed behind them, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. The weeks following that confrontation brought attempts at reconciliation that I'd expected but refused to acknowledge. My children called repeatedly. I blocked their numbers. They sent letters filled with apologies and justifications. I returned them unopened. They showed up at my door with tears and promises that they'd changed. I didn't answer. Mr. Patterson handled all communication with cease and desist letters that made my position unmistakably clear. I was done. The fallout in their lives was swift and merciless. Word spread through our community like wildfire. David's wife, disgusted by what he'd tried to do to his own mother, filed for divorce within a month. She'd always been a good woman, and learning about his cruelty was apparently the final straw in a marriage that had other problems. Susan lost several major clients at her marketing firm when business owners learned about her character. People don't want to work with someone who would betray their own mother for money. Michael's business partner decided to buy him out, unwilling to have his own reputation tarnished by association with someone so heartless. Meanwhile, I discovered a version of myself I'd forgotten existed. The woman who'd immigrated with nothing and built everything through determination and strength. She'd been buried under years of maternal sacrifice, but she wasn't gone. I booked a flight to Paris, something I'd dreamed about for 50 years but never allowed myself. I walked along the Seine at sunset, ate croissants in small cafes, and felt genuinely free for the first time in decades. I traveled to Italy, to Ireland, to places I'd only seen in magazines while working double shifts to pay for my children's college tuitions. I volunteered with the charitable foundation managing my rental property, meeting young people whose eyes lit up when they received scholarships. Their genuine gratitude reminded me what appreciation actually looked like, something I'd never really received from my own children. 6 months after that confrontation, I sat in a cafe in Rome, watching the sunset paint the ancient buildings in shades of gold and amber. My phone buzzed with messages from my grandchildren, the older ones who were now adults themselves. They'd reached out privately, apologizing for their parents, expressing shame about what had almost happened. We were slowly, carefully rebuilding relationships on new terms, honest terms, where respect went both ways. I thought about the mother I'd been, selfless to the point of self-destruction, giving everything and asking nothing, believing that unconditional love meant accepting any treatment. That woman was gone. In her place sat someone stronger, someone who understood that love without respect is just exploitation with a prettier name. I lost my children, yes, but I found something more valuable: my dignity, my peace, and my sense of self-worth. I learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who see you as an obligation rather than a blessing, even when those people share your blood. And sitting in that Roman cafe, sipping wine I once thought was too expensive for someone like me, watching the world continue in all its beautiful chaos, I realized something profound. I didn't just survive my children's betrayal. I was finally, truly free. Margaret's story teaches us that giving everything doesn't guarantee receiving anything in return. Family isn't automatically sacred just because of shared blood. It's made sacred through mutual love, respect, and genuine care. When people show you they value your possessions more than your presence, believe them the first time. And remember that the greatest act of self-love is refusing to let anyone, even your own children, treat you as less than your worth. Your life's work deserves protection. Your dignity deserves defense. Your peace deserves priority. Never feel guilty for setting boundaries with people who crossed them first, and never apologize for choosing yourself when others chose greed over you. You can sacrifice everything for your children and still not be enough for them if they've learned to value things over people. The hardest lesson is this: unconditional love doesn't mean accepting conditional respect. You can love your children from a distance while protecting yourself from their toxicity. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for them and for yourself is to let them face the consequences of their choices. Growth rarely comes from being rescued. It comes from hitting rock bottom and having to climb back up. Margaret spent 50 years being a mother. In one transformative month, she learned to be her own protector, her own advocate, and her own priority. She discovered that you can survive the death of relationships you thought were permanent, and that sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a liberation. Now I want to hear from you. What would you do if you discovered your own children were plotting to take everything from you? Would you confront them immediately, or would you plan your response carefully like Margaret did? Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you sacrificed everything for? A child, a spouse, a family member, a friend? More importantly, if you're currently in a situation where people are taking advantage of your generosity, treating your kindness as weakness, or seeing you as an obstacle rather than a blessing, what's stopping you from protecting yourself? Sometimes we need to hear someone else's story to find the courage to write our own ending. Share your thoughts, your experiences, or your advice in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. It might give another person the courage to choose themselves, to set boundaries, to walk away from toxicity even when it wears a familiar face. If Margaret's story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that you deserve respect and dignity regardless of your age, hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about real people facing impossible choices and finding the strength to choose themselves. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe someone who's being taken advantage of. Maybe someone who's struggling to set boundaries. Maybe someone who needs permission to put themselves first for once. Remember, you cannot pour from an empty cup, and you don't owe anyone the right to drain you dry. Your worth isn't determined by how much you give or how much you sacrifice. Your worth is inherent, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve access to your life, your resources, or your love. Protect your peace. Demand the respect you deserve. And never, ever feel guilty for choosing dignity over obligation. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say no more to people who've been saying not enough to you for years. You deserve better, and it's never too late to